Born to the Mob, the story of Frankie Saggio. Introduction. A freelancer in the Mafia world. Frankie Saggio was born in the Bensonhurst district of Brooklyn on 7 September 1964. The neighborhood was home to many Castellammarese. His uncle, Philip Giaccone, Philly Lucky, had been born in Ridgewood, Queens, but his mother came from Castellammarese del Golfo. It seems that Giaccone had not wanted to join the Mafia, but he had no choice. His father died in the middle of the Depression, leaving Philly Lucky to provide for his mother and sister. He was recruited by John Bonaventura, who ran most of the local rackets for the Bonanno family. Philly Lucky got to run all the business coming out of Kennedy Airport. He even got Frankie's father a no-show job at the airport, while Saggio Sewer ran his own auto body shop. His father did not get involved in the holdups and other criminal activities because he was a hemophiliac and was in and out of hospital having blood transfusions. The death of Uncle Philly did not put Frank Saggio off a life of crime, but he decided that, to avoid the modern mob treachery, he would not sign up to any single mob family. Instead, he would work freelance for all five. He could do this because he was one of the biggest earners in the business, pulling down millions and kicking a share upstairs to the bosses. He quickly graduated from sticking up drug dealers and stealing cars to bankrupting Wall Street brokers, providing protection for porno rackets and overseeing the mob forays into movie production. But those in power decided that he could not stay freelance forever. He was, after all, tied by blood to the Bonanno family, the family that had murdered his uncle. With mob family ties that stretched back to his great-grandfather Joseph, Frankie's career path was as good as chosen. And while Philly Lucky was dead, his name still translated into respect. Frankie narrowly escaped an assassination attempt and was busted for a major scam. As he had no loyalty to the Bonannos, who were now trying to kill him, Frankie turned himself over to the feds on the one condition: he would not squeal on his own relatives. Saggio told them everything else he knew. He was protected by the FBI and U.S. Marshals, then handed over to the Federal Witness Security Program. He was a fugitive from the mob, and later a fugitive from the government. However, in the early 2000s, he took the time to sit down with the crime writer Fred Rosen. Together they wrote Born to the Mob, which explains how Saggio had got into a life of crime and what he had learned about the old-style mafia from his Uncle Philly. If stories like this fascinate you, the power, the betrayal, the secrets behind the headlines, make sure you're following Behind the Veil Truths. We're only just scratching the surface. Early life, influenced by Uncle Philly. From an early age, Frankie would sit out on the stoop of his home and listen to the stories Uncle Philly and other wise guys would tell him. These men were contemporaries of Al Capone, who himself had been born in Brooklyn. After school, Frankie would play outside the Italian social clubs on 18th Avenue and watch the gangsters go in and out, and Philly Lucky preached violence. Frankie, he told the young boy, if someone bothers you in school or out on the street, you pick up anything you find, a baseball bat, a brick, a garbage can, and bash their skull in. From the age of 7, his uncle would take him over the East River to have a haircut, a shoe shine, and lunch in Little Italy. It was there that Frankie got a detailed education in the ways of the Cosa Nostra. Uncle Philly was steeped in the Mafia ethos. His father-in-law was Carlo Gambino, head of the Gambino crime family. If one of his men turned up at his house with his girlfriend, the door would be shut in his face. He would be told to come with his wife, or not at all. Frankie was warned never to gamble. The idea was to run the games and never to be a player, as the house always wins. Uncle Philly knew what he was talking about. He ran a horse room, an illegal off-track betting shop, and a Shylock business, loan sharking. According to Frankie Saggio, it was his uncle who taught him the value of $1 and how to steal it from someone else. Young Frankie also noticed that people were always giving his uncle envelopes, including one, he noted, with $25K written on it. Uncle Philly was from an era when being in a mafia family meant being bound by blood and honor. But by the time Frankie was growing up, those days were coming to an end. By the 1970s, their only concern was money. Mafia history and family ties, the Castellammarese connection. The Warner Brothers crime films of the 1930s, particularly 1931's Public Enemy starring James Cagney in his career-making role, and any film with Humphrey Bogart or Edward G. Robinson, succeeded in showing the kind of poverty and social conditioning that produced the original group of gangsters that ruled the rackets in the first part of the century to 1931. Reality intruded in 1932. That year, on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, 3 men took a walk. What they discussed was a blueprint for organized crime in New York. If executed well, it would ensure that the operation would eventually control a network that would infiltrate all 50 states. The story may be apocryphal, but there is no denying the facts. At some point in 1932-33, Charles Charlie Lucky Luciano, aka Lucky Luciano, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Meyer Lansky came up with the idea of organizing crime. The outfit was Lucky Luciano's name for this brand of crime that the three men introduced into the U.S. The two tough Jews and their brilliant Italian counterpart came up with the rather civilized concept of killing only for monetary gain. Monetary gain was everything. Eventually, Luciano's outfit would become a nationwide group of well-organized criminals run by the five families of New York. Frankie's great-uncle Suvio Grimaldi gave Frankie his first tie to the Profassi Colombo family. His uncle Jimmy Clemenza gave him his second. Outside in Spaghetti Park, Frankie was thinking of his uncle Jimmy too. He knew Tony was going to mention Suvio and Jimmy. They were his only chance to stay clear of the Bonanos. He didn't want to be put into a situation where he had to constantly be watching his back. As Frankie waited in the park, he remembered the story the Saggio family told about the one time Uncle Jimmy went to kill somebody and things didn't go right. It was such a famous story that Francis Ford Coppola and Mario Puzo used it for the pivotal scene in The Godfather Part 2. The Corleone family has a disgruntled old line capo named Frankie Five Angels, Pantangelo. He hates those pimps, the Risotto brothers, who have no respect and are butching in on his action. He goes to the Don, Michael Corleone, to ask permission to kill them, but Michael refuses. He's too involved in other business deals with Hyman Roth to want the attention that would result from the Risotto brothers' assassinations. Shortly after Michael turns down his request, Frankie Five Angels is in a bar back in New York when two guys come in and try to garrote him. They have the piano wire wound tightly around his throat and are squeezing the life out of him when a cop stumbles in and sees what's happening. Before he can react, the two assassins gun him down and flee. Frankie Five Angels recovers, thinks it was Michael who arranged his death, and decides to testify against him before a Senate committee that is looking into organized crime. Michael eventually discovers that it was Hyman Roth who planned Frankie Five Angels' assassination. Through a series of deft maneuvers, not only does Frankie Five Angels fail to implicate Michael, he absolves him of any criminal responsibility. He then conveniently takes his own life, which seals his lips forever. Michael is left to rule his criminal empire unimpaired. The actual story has none of the movie's glamour, but the real drama. During the Depression, James Jimmy Brown Clemenza was a gangster. He wasn't some newspaper hound like Babyface Nelson, Pretty Boy Floyd, or Bonnie and Clyde, the gangsters who robbed and killed for kicks and headlines. Jimmy was in it for the money. He did his job without the headlines. To Clemenza and the professional thieves and murderers in the mob, headlines meant attention. Attention meant cops. Cops meant prison. Prison was a fate to be avoided if possible, and it was always possible. Jimmy bootlegged quietly in Cicero, a suburb of Chicago, with another boy from the Brooklyn mob named Scarface, Al Capone. While officially attached to what would become the Profassi family, Jimmy was on loan to Capone's mob. When Prohibition was repealed in 1932, Jimmy came home to Brooklyn. Over the next 3 decades, he would do all kinds of jobs for the Profassi family. Jimmy Brown had served the Profassi family faithfully since its inception, and he would continue to do so until he died. He was a true old-liner, a skipper who believed in keeping your word and your place, which is why he watched with distaste as the Gallo brothers kept trying to butch in on the Profassis' action. Throughout the 1950s, Larry Gallo, Joseph Crazy Joe Gallo, and their youngest brother Albert Kid Blast Gallo worked as assassins for Nicholas Jiggs Forlano. The New York State Commission of Investigation would later identify Forlano, a member of the Profassi family, as the biggest loan shark in New York City. The Gallo brothers got tired of waiting to move up the mob ladder. In 1959, they formed their own gang of about 20 with guys in the Profassi family who were equally dissatisfied with Profassi's leadership. While Crazy Joe was the one to be feared in any encounter, he had been certified as insane by a psychiatrist at Brooklyn's Kings County Hospital in 1950. It was Larry who was the brains. If Larry were out of the way, Joey, Kid Blast, and the rest would fall into the gutter. Before anything like that could happen, the Gallos, with their ranks swelling to 100 disaffected, got some of their guys to kidnap 4 of Profassi's closest advisors. Held for ransom, they were eventually released. Profassi then convinced most of the 100 insurgents to come back into the fold. The Gallos, though, were a different story. Profassi believed they deserved retribution for the rebellion they had fomented. The neighborhood was Flatbush, a mostly Jewish area of Brooklyn. A few Italians also lived there in real middle-class splendor. Flatbush was a step up from Bensonhurst. There were fewer attached 4-family houses there, mostly semi-detached 2s and standalone singles. One of the main access roads was Eastern Parkway, designed by Frederick Olmsted, the same man who designed Central Park. On 25 August 1961, Larry Gallo went to the Sahara restaurant, a tavern serving only wine and beer, on Utica Avenue in Flatbush. In the dark interior, Larry lounged at the bar over his Pabst Blue Ribbon draft. Outside and down the block, a white sedan pulled up to the curb. Still drinking in the tavern, Gallo had no idea it was there. Inside the sedan were three men, Jimmy Clemenza, his brother Peter Clemenza, and an associate, John Skymone. Jimmy Clemenza got out of the car and quietly walked down the street. He approached the Sahara steadily but warily, checking for cops and witnesses. Then he turned and quickly walked in the door, his pork pie slouch hat covering his face. Gallo was swallowing some beer when a rope wound around his throat. One moment it wasn't there. Then it was, As Gallo reached up to pull it off, Jimmy Clemenza pulled harder. The fibers of the rope sank deeper into Larry Gallo's flesh. Gallo knew he was being garroted. He knew the action had to have been ordered by the Profacis, with the commission signing off on the assassination. He also knew there wasn't much he could do. The person strangling him, he still didn't know who it was, had incredibly strong hands. Despite his struggles, he was dying. Clemenza was literally choking the life out of Gallo. He knew from having done it before that Larry Gallo would stay conscious for at least the first minute and a half. Then Gallo's brain would suffer oxygen deprivation, and he'd black out. Until then, it would be sheer, unrelenting agony. Even when Gallo went limp in his hands, Clemenza would know he was unconscious but not dead. If he stopped strangling him at that point, there was a possibility that Gallo could be revived. Clemenza would keep up the pressure until he heard his hyoid or throat bone crack and then apply still more pressure until Gallo was clearly, definitely, absolutely dead. Larry Gallo was just on the verge of passing out when Sergeant Edward Maher stumbled onto the scene. Mager had been in a radio car at 2:45 p.m. with patrolman Melvin Beale when he decided to go into the tavern for a routine inspection. Jimmy Clemenza, seeing Maher coming in, dropped Gallo to the floor and hid. When Maher got inside, it took a second for his eyes to adjust to the gloom. Then he saw a man lying motionless on the dirty floor and heard him groaning. Mager crossed the room and bent down to assess the man's condition. Just then, Jimmy Clemenza raced out of the shadows to the waiting getaway car. Outside, Beale saw Clemenza running and gave chase. Clemenza turned and ran up the street. The white sedan, the getaway car, followed. Someone inside the car, either Peter Clemenza or Simone, stuck a revolver out of a window and fired a shot that hit Beale on the right cheek. Jimmy Clemenza jerked open the car door and hustled inside. For a man who weighed over 250 pounds, he moved quickly when he had to. Hearing the shots, Mager fled the bar, saw the automobile escaping, pulled his service revolver and fired 2 shots as the sedan turned north on Utica Avenue and sped north. He didn't hit anything. 4 blocks away, at the intersection of Snyder Avenue and East 49th Street, the sedan slowed down. As bystanders watched in surprise, John Simone was pushed out of the car and unceremoniously hit the street. Apparently, the Clemenzas felt he was expendable. Simone, who had been arrested 30 years before for assault and robbery, made a good patsy. He could be blamed for the attempted murder. Larry Gallo survived, though his voice was a little hoarse after that. As for Jimmy Brown, it was the only time he failed to clip someone. No one held it against him, however. It was just dumb luck that the cop showed up. By the following year, Jimmy Brown once again had to adjust to changing times. On 6 June 1962, the 28th anniversary of D-Day, Joseph Profaci died in the Southside Hospital on Long Island. The cause of death was cancer. There is always an immediate rush to fill the vacuum created whenever a family head dies. But Profaci had no heirs. His brother-in-law, Giuseppe Magliocco, stepped up to fill his shoes and assumed control of the family enterprises. Looking on with a gleam in his criminal eye was boss Joe Bonanno. Profaci had been his close friend. Nevertheless, his death gave Bonanno an unbelievable opportunity to become the most powerful crime boss since Maranzano. Bonanno devised a scheme that involved clipping family heads Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese and Tommy's cousin Buffalo, NY family boss Stefano Magaddino. Unfortunately, Bonanno was relying on the young capo Joseph Colombo to take care of the killings. Colombo was actually in tight with Carlo Gambino. He looked at Gambino like a father. He would never betray him. When Gambino found out from Colombo about Bonanno's scheme, he called the commission into session. Bonanno was asked to explain himself. The deceitful boss was able to talk his way out of having his body carved up and distributed throughout the New York metropolitan area. He retired to Arizona in the late 1960s. As for Colombo, with Gambino's backing, he became head of the old Profaci family, newly christened the Colombo family. Jimmy Clemenza would continue to do jobs as demanded by his family and also become a capo until he retired to Florida in the late 1970s. My uncles Jimmy and Philly bought in Hallandale, Florida in 1978, says Frankie. The building was all Italian and Jewish gangsters. Funniest thing you ever saw. They would argue day and night. They had a clubhouse where they played cards. All they did was make Hallandale into Brooklyn. They'd been playing cards back home in New York for 30 years. Let's see, who else was there from New York? Scotty D'Angelo, Joe Sausage, who owns GS Sausage in Jersey, Angelo Ponte, who owns Ponte Karting. He just went away on extortion. My Uncle Jimmy used to curse every one of them. I remember standing in a parking lot talking to Scotty D'Angelo. I'm 18 or 19 and these condos all have catwalks and my uncle yells down, "What you doing?" talking to that cheap bastard. I was embarrassed. I couldn't understand why Scotty's name was Scotty until someone explained Scotty means cheap in Italian. Besides Hallandale, Clemenza had a home in Florida, NY, where he raised horses. When Jimmy wasn't at home either at the farm or at the Florida condo, he could usually be found in North Carolina. Uncle Jimmy used to go to Duke University in North Carolina for the rice diet, Frankie says. He was a big guy, really fat, and he needed to lose weight. Lena Saggio, Frankie's sister, takes up the story. My cousin Corinne told me about the rice diet. She said that Uncle Jimmy went down there for years to lose weight. Boy, I'd love for you to go, she said. I needed to lose some weight then, so I went down in 1984 with the agreement that my Uncle Jimmy was there and he'd take care of me. You're here to do one thing and one thing only. You're going to lose weight and forget about anything else, Uncle Jimmy said to me as soon as I got off the plane. He was heavy and had a rough voice from all the cigars he smoked. He said whatever he felt like and you just had to take it. We stayed at a hotel where he was head honcho. Every day he took my arm and we'd have to walk 8 miles a day to get our meals. He had a driver down there too, and him and the driver would follow me with the caddy to make sure nothing happened. Uncle Jimmy, he was respected everywhere. Even when he was doing the diet and went in the hospital to give blood and urine samples, it was always, "Good morning, Mr. Clemenza. How you doing, Mr. Clemenza?" from the staff. But even Jimmy Clemenza's considerable influence was not enough to stop love from blooming. What happened was he used to watch me from his window when I'd go out. He was afraid I'd go and eat something or meet the wrong kind of person. One day I met my husband-to-be, Kelly Scott, at a convenience store next door to the hotel. I was there buying cigarettes and started talking to him. "Come to the hotel and have lunch," I suggested. "Okay, I'll come over," he said. When he walked in the front door, he was stopped by Uncle Jimmy. "You go in the dining room," Uncle Jimmy told me. But I stayed to listen. "Do you know who I am?" he asked Kelly. "No," Kelly answered. "This is my niece. Leave her alone and stay away from her." "I like her and I think she's nice," Kelly said. "See the leather on your shoes? Keep walking," said Uncle Jimmy, and his chauffeur escorted Kelly out. I was crying. I called up my father. He talked to Uncle Jimmy. My father told Uncle Jimmy not to hurt him. My brother, he talked to Uncle Jimmy and got him to cool off and leave me alone. But Uncle Jimmy was still giving Kelly the business. So a couple of days later, I took off with Kelly and left Uncle Jimmy behind. Eventually, Lena married Kelly and her family accepted him as one of their own. A few years later, Uncle Jimmy died a peaceful, natural death. He had managed to live his life the way he wanted, as a true outlaw who, in the end, died in bed. But Uncle Jimmy also knew he was one of the few who actually fulfilled such a wish. If you appreciate deep, unfiltered investigations into the real underworld, not the Hollywood version, consider subscribing to Behind the Veil Truths. It helps us keep opening files like this, Frankie's entry into crime, forming a crew in scams. Soon after joining the Bananos, Frankie narrowly escaped an assassination attempt and was busted for a major scam. Frankie was a restless young man and wanted to start making a name for himself within the outfit. Using the juice that his uncle's reputation still carried, Frankie formed his own crew of young independents. Mikey Hollywood, as handsome as a Ken doll, from the Genovese family. Larry Zano and his brother Junior, also from the Genovese. And Chris Caponelli, his brother Anthony, and Mikey Paradiso from the Gambino family. Everyone was tied in and we all hung out and did stuff together, Frankie recalls. We all had thousands in cash in our pockets from the sale of the stolen goods. We started hanging together. We did armed robberies of drug dealers, never civilians. See, Chris was selling pot, coke, stuff like that. We'd make 10 to 15K on the sale of the drugs. But it wasn't enough. Why bother buying the shit when we could steal it? Instead of making 10 or 15, we'd get 30. We'd rob the dealer and unload the shit ourselves. We didn't care who we robbed, if they were connected or not. And that started it. That was our specialty. That became our full-time job, finding guys who were buying from the dealers, getting their routines down and going in when they'd have the most cash or product. Our main guy for getting rid of the stuff was Tony Armente, who was a banana soldier. Sometimes when we didn't have anybody lined up to take off, we'd buy from Tony. You gotta understand, this guy would kill you, stab you in the heart to stop you from bleeding, cut your throat, hang you upside down in the shower to drain your blood, cut you into 10 different pieces, and carry them out in a bunch of American tourister luggage. Tony would bury you out in this bird sanctuary on Staten Island, also called Boot Hill. Tony was on America's Most Wanted. Tony's now doing about 400 years in jail. Of all the wise guys Frankie met in this period of his life, the one he formed a lasting friendship with was Michael Mikey Hollywood Groke. Mikey had an unusual background for a wise guy. His father was a New York City detective, first grade, who became the president of the Patrolmen's Benevolent Association, the chief negotiating arm of the NYPD. Mikey had rebelled against his father's life as a lawman. Instead, Mikey chose the fast, dangerous, moneyed life of a gangster. Mikey was as tough as they come. We started scheming, robbing. We got into the cigarette, cigar, and liquor business. Sometimes we'd take a truck down to North Carolina where we'd scam wholesalers out of $100,000 of cigarettes, then bring it back and sell them. Most times we'd place orders at cigarette wholesalers. We'd come up with some phony name for our restaurant or club, or tell them we were opening up a bunch of newsstands, give them an address of an abandoned building, and then have them ship hundreds of cartons of cigarettes to it. We'd pay them with phony certified checks that we printed up ourselves on a regular check writer. Through such scams, Frankie and Mikey started racking up the dough, and Frankie's criminal career as an independent started to take off. Then Tommy D came over. He said he'd heard about how well I was doing, that I was a good earner. The bottom line with these guys is money. He wanted me with him because I had a reputation as a mover. Fuck him. I couldn't stand the son of a bitch. Frankie wanted to steer clear of the Bananos, not just because they killed his uncle, but because the politics of the family were in such disarray. With Rastellian power, the family had lost face. The idea of associating with just one family seemed to have its liabilities. I didn't want to end up like my uncle. He had been a Bonanno his whole life. He'd been loyal to them, then they clipped him and buried him somewhere. I began to think about going a different way. I wanted to move around freely. I didn't want anybody busting my balls. I wanted to do business with any crew. Everyone stuck to their own crew. If I wasn't with any crew, I could move around and not answer to anyone. The auto body scam, building an empire. Frankie never read any of the self-help books of the 1980s, but he followed some of their best advice. Make money doing something you love. Only he didn't quite do it in the way the self-help gurus had in mind. Basically, it really was a body shop. Continental Auto Body was the name of it. We started out actually doing collision work in islip. I used to paint cars. I actually liked it. It was very relaxing. Did that for a while. My firm was doing very well. Then I started seeing there was a lot of money in parts, especially bumpers. Bumpers? Do you remember at the time in the early 80s in New York when there were all these caddies riding around without front bumpers? It was the biggest thing to rob. People just wanted them. I don't know why. Who cared? I was getting $1,000 just for the bumper. Corvette T-tops, the glass roofs, were also huge at the time. You couldn't park your Corvette anyplace without having the hap stolen. Frankie had his own crew of car thieves roaming the night streets, shadows passing through the orange sodium streetlights. Frankie followed the old adage, waste not, want not. The parts business brought in a lot of money, but there was a lot of labor involved. It's easier to just sell the whole car. Trans Ams, Camaros, Corvettes, they were real big then. And also at the time I had a guy. He was a good friend named of Paddy Testa. He was a made guy with the Gambinos. He actually had an auto body place in Flatbush on Utica Avenue. Paddy was exporting stolen cars out of the country. Paddy and his brother Joey were with Roy DeMeo, who ran a crew for Nino Gaggi, a skipper with the Gambinos. My uncle Jimmy Clemenza was friends with Roy. That's how I met that whole crew. They were my friends since I was a kid. I did a ton of business with Roy, Paddy, and Joey, all of them. The way it worked, Paddy'd call me up and give me an order. I need 2 Lincoln Town cars, Frankie. I need a black Coupe de Ville. I need a Buick Riviera, Paddy would say. We'd agree on the price, which was usually $2,500 a car. I'd get my guys to go out and get them at night, and the next day I'd go down to the Gemini Lounge where Paddy worked. We'd park the cars on Utica Avenue, Avenue M, whatever, and leave them with the keys under the mat, and he'd give me 10, 20,000, whatever it was. The Gemini Lounge had a reputation. The Gemini Lounge. A fucking wild joint, says Frankie, laughing. You didn't want to be in the Gemini Lounge at the wrong time when anybody was on drugs or fucked up. That crew killed a lot of guys. Everyone knew they were nuts. I don't think they ever killed anybody for money. When Nino Gaggi needed work done, he went there. They fucked up a lot of guys. These were kids restless to make their way up, and Roy was shooting to get his button. If you got in his way, you went. The Gemini, it was like a lot of naughty pine, that old beamed look. Bar on the right, tables on the left. When I'd walk in, I'd see Joey Testa sitting at one table. He was a fucking homicidal maniac. Sometimes I'd see Richie the Iceman there. He was another one. Richie did a lot of contracts for the Gambinos. There was a door that led to the back. There was an apartment back there. I never saw the Gorton fisherman outfits that protected the gangsters, clothes from victims, blood, but I heard the stories. But see, you don't ask questions. There are no daily gangster announcements. Who'd you clip this week? These guys are friends of mine. I never looked at it in a frightening way. I was going to see Joey, we're all friends. And Roy? He was always a gentleman with me. I didn't worry about his temper or any of that shit. I was a kid, what did I know? I thought I was invincible. If it was today, I would still do business with them, but I'd have a fucking pistol on me, safety off. Frankie's business dealings with DeMeo and his crew came to an abrupt end on 10 January 1983. Skipper Nino Gaggi allegedly clipped DeMeo, then stuffed the corpse in the trunk of DeMeo's own car. The killing had supposedly been carried out at the behest of Gambino boss Paul Castellano, who had grown tired of DeMeo's arrogance and indiscriminate killing, which was bad for business. Castellano had first asked his underboss John Gotti to do the job, but the future Dapper Don politely refused. Gotti would eventually kill Castellano and supplant him as boss. I fucking hated Gotti, and so did everyone else. The son of a bitch brought more attention to wise guys than anyone did. Every time federal prosecutor and later NYC Mayor Giuliani prosecuted him, we kept rooting for his conviction. But that was in the future. Frankie still had to make a living in the present. With DeMeo out of the way, he needed a new outlet for his car theft business. I started dealing with a guy on the island, Bones. He had a Nissan dealership in front and a used body shop in the back. Whatever their suspicion, the legitimate workers at the dealership kept their mouths shut. You didn't have to be brilliant to figure out that if you opened your mouth to the cops, you'd wind up in Gravesend Bay. The water was so foul there, it actually dissolved metal. Flesh was no problem. Now I'm dealing with Bones and another guy who worked there, Sally Regina, overheard that I was the guy who got all the cars. He came up to me and started talking to me about cars and shit, and I didn't trust him too much. I don't really want to deal with this guy. I really wouldn't talk to him. I just didn't trust him. There was something about him, like he's listening too close or something. But fucking greed takes over. I let Rico handle him. I wouldn't talk to him, but my partner Rico, man, did he talk. Rico starts dealing with Sally Regina. I'd go to Regina's house and I really wouldn't talk. But my partner Rico starts asking, "What do you want? Tell me what you need." "We can get you anything." He put us in such a hole, that kid, with his mouth. One time we were over at Regina's house where we'd dropped the cars off and we're in the garage. And Regina says, "Oh, my phone's ringing." And he runs back in the house. I find out later the batteries are fucking up on the wire he's wearing. I find that out later on when my lawyer gets the tapes. The only thing they have me on tape saying is, "To be honest with you, I really don't want to deal with you. You look like a cop to me." The guy, of course, denies it. 6 months went by. On a bright July day in 1984, Frankie and Rico went to Sally Regina's house to make a delivery. We go to his house with a brand new stretch caddy with 500 miles, a T1 Porsche, and a 1984 Riviera. We're in the driveway and the money's about to change hands when all of a sudden this guy pulls up in a white caddy, wearing, I'll never forget, a black members only jacket, a gray-haired guy. Regina introduces him. "Oh, this is my partner Terry." I said, "Partner? What are you talking about?" Frankie was angry and suspicious. Suddenly, after dealing with Regina for a while, he suddenly has a partner that crawls out of the woodwork. Something just wasn't right. I walk away, Rico stays there, and he's talking to the guy. I'm telling him, "Are you out of your fucking mind? Look at that guy. That guy's a cop." So after a while, this guy Terry drives off, and I'm standing in the driveway and going to get my car to leave. And I see a squad car come down the street, and I'm like, what the fuck? Nah, this can't be. You know how you get that feeling? Nah, this can't be for real. But it was. Sure enough, the fucking police car pulls right into the fucking driveway. I go to turn and run, and all I see are guys coming from everywhere. About 10 cops run through a neighbor's yard, destroying his plants, and jump over the back fence and some hedges. And then they jump me, about 10 of them, cuff me and get me up. Unmarked cars pull up. Usually when a suspect is arrested in Suffolk County on Long Island, they are taken to the closest precinct for booking, but not Frankie and Rico. They take us directly to the district attorney's office in Halpage and right up to the Rackets Bureau. They read us our rights and started questioning us. Rico, too. They got to make a production out of it so we don't think he set us up. They tell us how bad they got us, how they got us transporting stolen cars interstate, which is a federal beef. The cops were making Frankie out to be the mastermind of a major car ring, which he was, but at the time, Frankie didn't have the perspective to see that. He simply considered himself a guy on the way up, just trying to make a living any way he could. As far as he was concerned, he wasn't hurting anybody. Everything he stole, he figured, was insured. Everything he stole was new. Who cared if the insurance companies had to pay up? The outcome was they took us and arraigned us. I had gotten arrested a few years before when I was still a juvenile for a burglary. I got probation. At the time, my record from my first case was sealed. My father had made sure it was because I'd been a minor. I got the mug pictures back and everything. So now this looks like my first arrest, not second. I know my first arrest was a B felony. I've had a little experience. And the cops start talking and saying this shit about wanting to help me, and I stop them cold. Listen, I want a lawyer. Soon as I said that, everything stopped, which is the way it's supposed to be. Once a suspect asserts their constitutional right to an attorney by law, the questioning has to cease. But in Suffolk County, as a state commission would discover, that wasn't always the case. Suffolk County detectives were infamous for beating confessions out of suspects, regardless of what rights were invoked. With Frankie, though, there would have been no point. Uncle Philly had ingrained the code of omerta on Frankie's soul. There was no way he would talk. The cops, though, continued to try. They'd still come into the interrogation room where they were holding me, you know, the kind of place with a battered desk and chairs and walls painted puke green. They'd try and scare me into talking. Oh, you'll get 30 years, stuff like that. Fuck that. Finally, they take me for arraignment. We get outside, and what do I see out front? Parked in front of the DA's office are the stretch caddy, the T1 Porsche, and the 1984 Buick Riviera. They were fucking with us. Hey, Frankie, does that look familiar? What do you think of that limo? One of the cops asked. That's nice. Is it yours? I asked him. They drove Frankie and Rico to the arraignment out east, as Long Islanders like to say, into the furthest recesses of Suffolk County, to the drab state Supreme Court building in Riverhead, the county seat. Listen to this. The judge is Michael Manon, my father's first cousin. He knows my name. He knows who I am. I go for arraignment, and all they get me on was 50 counts criminal possession of stolen property in the first degree. The fucking judge, I got no criminal record now. The judge, who's my cousin, sets bail at $500,000. So my father gets this lawyer, Hal Jordan, a wise guy lawyer, out of the Woolworth building in Manhattan. He comes back to the bullpen. Frankie, he says to me, Frankie, what the fuck was in the trunk of these cars? What did you have, bodies in the trunk? I tell him the judge must have a hard-on for me. I can't figure it out. Look, Frankie, he says, I got another bail hearing scheduled for next week, so you're going to have to lay up a little bit. I go the next week for the bail hearing before Judge Manon, and he reduces my bail to $40,000 cash, and I get out. Frankie was only out for 2 days before he went back down to the Nissan dealership to talk to the owner, Bones. I grab the guy and tell him, you got a fucking rat, bro. This guy's wearing a wire and everything. The guy didn't want to hear it. The guy's blowing me off. You got to be a fucking rat too, then. I come here to do you a fucking favor and you're blowing me off and telling me to be quiet? Now I end up thinking that Bones was involved too. So what happens is I see that the kid, Sally Regina, he's in the back working in the shop, that motherfucker. Sally wasn't a cop. He was just a guy who got pinched for something and was setting guys up to get out of trouble. I go in there, I got a fucking crowbar and I beat the fuck out of him. I bashed his skull in. A person can easily die from being beaten with a crowbar, but Frankie didn't really give a fuck at the time. I get home. By the time I get there, my lawyer already called. They were charging me with first-degree assault and revoking bail. I go down to turn myself in. My lawyer tells me, we take this to trial. There's no way we're going to win. They got too much on you. So Frankie did what he's good at. He made a deal. It was a score, actually. In return for dropping most of the charges against me, including the assault charge, I plead guilty to 3 counts of criminal possession of stolen property in the first degree. I went up before my cousin, Judge Manon, for sentencing, and he gave me 4 years. Every prisoner in the New York State Correctional System has to go through preliminary processing at the Downstate Correctional Facility in Fishkill, NY. The place is about 100 miles north of Long Island. I waited in the Riverhead jail until October, about 4 months before they took me to Downstate. After I sign in and everything, they assign me to Clinton State Prison. It's in an upstate town called Dannemora. Most cons just call the prison Dannemora. So for a nonviolent felony, first offense, they send me to a max A joint with perverts and murderers. There were guys doing 300 years there. He had merited such unusual first-time treatment because the racket squad, whose chief target consisted of mobsters, prosecuted him. In other words, did Frankie receive a more severe punishment because the cops in court perceived him as a known associate of organized crime? rather than an independent? Likely, which is ironic considering he was an independent. A month before, I'd had my 21st birthday on 10th of September, and it's my first time in prison. It didn't feel too good. A fucking 12 or 14-hour bus ride up to Dannemora and stopping at all these jails to pick up guys along the way. What they do is they shackle your feet, and they have this thing they put around your waist and they handcuff you without any chains so there's no play. Then they take the handcuffs and clip them to this little black metal box around your waist. You can't move. You have no fucking movement. So I ride for 14 hours on a bus like that. Fucking torture, bro. Torture. They give you a fucking sandwich, right? Try to get the fucking sandwich into your mouth. Frankie had been on the bus since the early morning. Even inside the bus with its closed windows, he could tell that the air had gotten colder. When they reached Plattsburgh, which is a little south of the Canadian border, the driver took a hard left. The bus rumbled along a dark two-lane road, Route 374, for 10 miles through the small town of Katyville, then climbed the Katyville Hills. At the top of the hill, the driver looked out his windshield. There, built into the side of a mountain, was Clinton State Prison. With a crackle of gears, the bus descended into hell. The first building on the right is currently called the Annex. Large coils of razor wire surround it. Not long ago, it was the state hospital for the criminal insane. The town residents called it the Bug House. Now it's used to house inmates. When the bus finally arrived inside the prison walls at about midnight, Frankie got out and looked around. The moon was half full and he could make out a series of buildings of all shapes and sizes. At the top of the buildings, silhouetted against the dark night sky, was the unpleasant image of barbed wire twisted into ugly coils. "This way," said a guard, and marched the prisoners inside a low-lying building. Frankie marched, but kept looking around. He saw armed guards patrolling the grounds. He noticed the towers, set up at intervals around the prison. He could see the bare outline of the guards inside of them. He figured they must be marksmen carrying rifles fitted with sniper scopes, in case inmates were stupid enough to attempt an escape. He later found out that he was right. They took me in, processed me, name, prints, pictures, shit like that. Then they took me up to the cell block. It was fucking huge, an old maximum security cell block with one-man cells. Looked like something from one of those old movies. I start walking down the catwalk and everyone starts screaming, new Jack, throwing shit. For a 21-year-old, it was a pretty wild experience. When Frankie got to his cell, he stopped for a second and then the guard pushed him in. In the 4-by-6-foot cell, he saw a bunk and a sink attached to a toilet. The overhead light was just a bare bulb and was so dim he couldn't see. Basically, it was useless, fucking dead. Frankie turned and faced the catwalk, and that's when he heard the sound for the first time. The cells were cranked closed. There was a chain that went through every cell, attached to a wheel at the end of the gallery. The guard turns a crank and you hear CR, and the bars start moving. Then bang! The bars hit home, sunk into the 3-foot-thick walls. Frankie looked around at his new home, out at the other cells, and listened as the screams died down until all that could be heard was snoring. He sat down on his bunk and suddenly, he began to think about his Uncle Philly, who had never been arrested in his life. Yet here he was in one of New York State's worst prisons for a non-violent felony. "I just didn't get it," says Frankie. "My uncle, he did so many things and never once got jailed. I really needed to figure it out." Saggio did figure to stay out of jail, but not how to stay out of trouble. Forced affiliation, joining the Bananos. Despite his lucrative career as a freelancer, organized crime has to be just that, organized. The 5 families decided that he would have to join one of them. Frankie did not want it to be the Bonanno family, but it did not look like he would have any choice. The first part of the discussion between the rival capos Tough Tony from the Genovese family and Tommy D from the Bonanno family centered on Philly Lucky. Despite the fact that the commission had sanctioned his assassination, only the commission could authorize the death of a capo. And despite the fact that he had been officially disgraced within the Bonanno family, Philly Lucky in death was still a Bonanno. Think of it, Frankie says. The sons of bitches had killed him, chopped his body up, and they still owned him and his family. That was the beauty of the outfit. Once you were in, they owned you and yours for generations, which meant it looked like Tommy D had won before the contest even began. And Tough Tony? Tony knew Frankie had held back on the kick with the brokerages. He didn't care. There'd been enough to go around for everyone. Frankie had said he would make money for everybody, and he had kept his word. The conversation would then have turned to Frankie's great-uncle Suvio Grimaldi. Suvio was Castellammarese. He had crossed the Atlantic in the early part of the 20th century during the same wave of immigration that had brought Salvatore Maranzano and Joe Bonanno to the United States. Maranzano had worked his way up the criminal chain and became one of New York's 2 big crime bosses. The other was Joseph Masseria. Both were eventually assassinated by men in the employ of Lucky Luciano, who would go on to create the Five Families with Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky. Joseph Bonanno worked his way up the ladder from soldier to boss and eventually ran his own family. During 1965, Bonanno attempted a power play in order to become the most powerful mafia boss and lost. He was forced into an early retirement in Arizona where he died in 2002. And Suvio, he became part of the Profaci family, which would later be renamed the Colombo family. Suvio married a woman named Octavia Glazo. She had a brother, Joseph. My grandfather Joseph was a handsome man with dark hair, recalls Patrina Saggio. He was stocky and a sharp dresser. My grandfather had a portable whip. During the summer in Brooklyn, a man would drive a trailer around. Attached to the trailer was a multi-armed octopus that whirled around with terrific centrifugal force. Kids would pay him a nickel and hop in for the ride. Joseph Glazo was the gentleman whose fingers were on the ride's power control. He also had an ice business. He carried the ice up the steps into people's homes when they still had ice boxes. He wasn't emotionally demonstrative to my grandmother, but he was a good man, Patrina says. In 1932, Joseph's brother-in-law Suvio, later Frankie's maternal great-uncle, was charged with illegal possession of firearms. Suvio, however, wasn't about to go to jail. Patrina recounts Suvio's craftiness. Suvio told his brother-in-law Joseph, "Look, Joe, if I'm convicted, I'll get a long sentence." My grandfather asked him why. "'Cause I got a record, I'll get a long sentence." "But you, Joe, you got no record. You take the rap, you'll be out a year, 2 tops." My grandmother, she loved her brother Suvio, so my grandfather did it for her. And that's how an innocent, good man named Joseph Glazo pleaded guilty to a crime he did not commit and served 2 years in the same state prison system that would house his great-grandson. In manipulating the situation, Suvio showed that he had mastered the real lesson of the gangster's trade: survival. And Joseph? Frankie says, when I heard that story about my great-grandfather Joseph, I thought, this guy has got balls. A stand-up guy. Later I realized he'd been duped too, but by that time there was no way out. After carefully evaluating all of Frankie's family tree, Tommy D and Tough Tony came to the conclusion that, if anywhere, Frankie belonged with the Colombos. 2 of his uncles had been in that family compared with only 1 in the Bonanno family. But the Colombos did not have a representative at the sit-down, and a Bonanno and Genovese were not about to give the Colombos the 5 families' prime earner. Tough Tony was forced to admit that he held the losing hand. There was no blood relationship between the Genovese and Frankie. Tony had just taken him in, while Tommy and the Bonannos could show a direct link to Frankie Saggio through Philip Giaccone. From across the street, Frankie watched as the door to the Parkside restaurant opened and Tony emerged, grim-faced. Frankie hoped that Tony had won and was just putting on an act for Tommy's benefit. Frankie remembers how Tony broke the news. "You belong with the Bonannos, kid." "There's nothing I could do," Tony told me. Tony felt bad. He knew how much I hated Tommy D. I was being forced to go back to work with the crew that killed my Uncle Philly. And now Frankie Saggio really needed to start watching his back. The mob calls it betrayal. The courtroom calls it testimony. What do you call it? If you want more stories where truth and loyalty collide, subscribe to Behind the Veil Truths and join the investigation.